There's kind of a couple of things we can notice too about this to help ourselves out. Just a general reminder, when you have a cosine graph in general, it's going to start up high, work its way down, and come back, almost like a V shape does. Because its base graph starts at 1 and then goes down and then comes back up. Typically, our sine graph starts below, goes up, and then comes back down. So it's more like the valley versus the hill, okay, when we're looking at cosine and sine. Once I get a general idea of if it's cosine or sine, the next thing, at least I think that's helpful, and we're just going to get a couple of steps in here, is we're going to find the center line. That dotted line that goes right through the middle of our graph, that is going to tell me my amplitude. So for instance, we'll kind of start building number 1 while we're talking about these steps. I notice kind of go into a valley here. So I'm pretty sure this is going to be cosine. Leave myself a little bit of room here just in case. Now my center line, remember, is almost like an average. It's right in the middle of my graph. So I need to pay attention to where the max and the min is. I got a maximum up here at 0. I got a minimum down at -4. So whatever's right flat dab in the middle is 0 and -4, which is -2, is where my center line's at. That helps me because that tells me my amplitude. Because again, amplitude is always going to be, a positive value. We'll just determine on the sign in a minute. So here I notice my distance from the center line to either a min or a max, doesn't matter which one, is 2. So my amplitude is 2. I can figure that out based on my center line. Okay. If you're trying to figure this out sometime and you're trying to say, well, does this go up? Does this go down? How do I figure out if it's going to be negative, positive, what it's going to be? Here's the other thing that I can look at. My base center line is always going to be at 0. Oops, let me get that where you can see it. So, it's 0, I'm sorry, I'm still getting in with that arrow, ain't I? It's 0 for base graphs. In other words, my center line, if I had a regular sine or a cosine graph, that dotted line is going to go right through at y equals 0 up here. And this is how we tell our amplitude, because however far away it is from 0, 1, 2, is going to tell me that amplitude value, even though I can count it also from my maxes and mins. So once I get that, I've got a 2, and I know it's not negative because this curves like a regular cosine graph would. Now, if it would have gone up and over, I might have been curious if it was going to be negative, but we'll get to a couple of those. Once I get the center line, my next job is my distance from maximum to maximum, or minimum to minimum, doesn't matter which I use, as long as I have 2 of both. That's going to equal my period. You're like, okay, so what are you talking about this time? Well, let's say, for instance, like, okay, here at the start and out here, there's where I get my full cycle for my cosine graph. However far it is from here to here is what my period is. Now, that doesn't tell me what I'm going to put in my equation, though. So that's what I have to watch out for. My period normally is what? 2 pi. So, since my normal period is 2 pi, 2 pi over b is going to equal whatever this new period is. Because that's my formula for finding the period. Well, this is what my period is. So I look and I say, okay, I got to figure out what b is, because that's going to tell me what the b value is. So there's a couple of ways I could do this. I'll be a little bit more direct in this one this time. But I'll look and I'd say, okay, so 6 pi b equals 2 pi, because you can either look at it like you're cross multiplying, or you could just say I'm multiplying both sides by b, because to solve for b, I got to get it out of the denominator. And then I'll just divide by 6 pi. Pi's will cancel, and my b value that I come up with is 1/3. So that becomes the value I put in front of my theta or x or whatever it is that you want to call it. So you're like, okay, a value, how far am I away from 0? 2, okay. Period, how far is it from max to max or min to min? They both work the same way. And then we set that little equation up. So what's left? Well, let's see. Anything with periods or vertical shifts. Let's see. We got the period set. A vertical shift. Now, when we're doing that, that's a little bit different. We're going to go from my center line, okay? And I can go to either my min, if I have it right here, or I could do it from the max as well. So I'm looking and I'm going, okay, to get to my lowest point, I went down 2 from my center line. So my k value is going to be -2. Like, wait a minute, you skipped amplitude, period, vertical shift. Okay. So I multiply my values by 2, which is true, because normally it'd be at 0, -1 for my first point. Got down to -2. My period expanded, hence the fraction. And then from my center line down to my minimum will tell me what that next value is going to be. So it's kind of picking my way through this, just looking for pieces. And we're going to knock out all of these on this side. So if there's pieces not quite yet, we'll get you there. And if I do something, you're like, wait, what did you just do again? Hit me again. We'll make sure we get it. Okay. First things first on 2. What type of graph does it look like, sine or cosine? Okay, it looks like cosine, because it looks like we kind of go down, we do the valley here. Okay, so we're pretty sure we're feeling good. This is going to be cosine. So then again, let's find our middle ground here. Where's my center line going to be for this one? -1, because my max is at 1, my min's at -3. Whatever's in the middle is going to get me that value. So again, my amplitude I find by saying, okay, let's see here. -1. So what's my a value going to be on this one? I thought I heard it. Okay. So it sounds like this time our amplitude is again going to be at 2. Because again, we're getting that distance working. Now we're even gonna, and I'll do this in a minute, I even got a way you can check this on a calculator if you want to. So I get my amplitude and I say, okay, my period, and again, I can go max to max, or I can go min to min. Either way, what's the distance on my period this time? Okay, pi. Because whether I'm going from 0 to pi, or pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2, it's the same distance. So my period is pi. So I look and I say, okay. So once I get that set, now I'm looking and I'm saying, okay, what can we do to go from my center line? Oh, I still got to finish my period. I'm trying to get way ahead here. You're like, well, wait a minute. I already know what 2 pi divided by what is pi. B is just 2. Okay. I was going to say, you don't have to go through the entire algebraic way of doing it. If you can just say, well, I know that 2 divided by 2 is 1, they'd cancel and leave me with that. So, get my 2 theta in there. And then again, from my center line, which typically is going to be at 0, I moved everything down 1. So if I started there and I moved down 1, my k value, or sometimes we call it d, it depends on which book you happen to be looking at, is -1. Because we're always looking at the distance from this back to the x-axis, back to my base center line. And if you wanted to get an idea of this, if this is, looking the way it should, because sometimes we all get those little doubts sometimes. So if I was in radians, I went to 2 cosine. Now again, be careful when you get here, because I don't want this -1 inside my parentheses. So I have 2 cosine of 2x -1. And I'm looking at this mainly for the picture. So then I can look at the graph, and I can see basically if I'm getting the same picture or not. If you really wanted to check, you can still take your table set, and maybe since this graph goes by pi over 2's, we go by pi over 2. So I start looking, I'm like, okay, 0, 1, okay. 1.57, pi over 2, is at -3. Pi, it's back at 1. 3 pi over 2, back at -3. And I can see visually, okay, I did this right. It worked out all right for me. I wouldn't just do that on every one, like try to get the answer that way and do it quicker that way, but I would give myself a shot. All right, let's see what else we can get ourselves into. What type of graph do we look like this time? Right off the bat, it looks like a sine graph, because it looks like we're going into a peak instead of a valley here. So I look and I say, okay, where's my center line at? Okay, -2. So, how far are we from our new center line to one of my maxes or mins? 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so amplitude's 4. We'll get that in. Then our period what's my period this time? How far is it from 1/2 to 5/2? Two pi. You're like, but wait a minute, that's what my normal period is. My normal period's 2 pi. Right, so if my normal period's 2 pi, my b value has to be 1. So in other words, I'm not going to be putting anything in front of my theta. You could put a 1, but you don't have to. So then my vertical shift, remember, is the distance from my regular center line to where my new one is at. So how did my line shift? It shifted down 2. We're always looking from 0 to where it shifts up or down. So my k value is -2. I put that on the end, I'm good to go. That's going to be my key on these, just those 3 things. Center line, new center line to a max or min, gets my amplitude. Find my period between maxes or mins, do the algebra if I have to. And then that center line back to 0 is going to tell me how much I've shifted up or down. They're like, maybe. I want to do one more with you before I put you on your own for one. 4, what do you think? Sine or cosine? Sine. Because again, we're going to the valley first. I mean the peak, excuse me. Now this gets a little more interesting. Where's my center line at? -2, because I have a max at 2. I have a min at -6. So I have to find the average or the middle of that. So that center line is going to tell me 2 things. It's going to tell me my amplitude, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, I could do it this way too. 1, 2, 3, 4. Get my amp. Ooh, the period this time. This looks kind of squished. Now some of you are like, okay. Nice. Okay, it's going to be pi over 2. Now some of you may be like, now how would you know that off the top of your head when those are in the middle? Notice though, 1, 2, they're 2 apart, and my tick marks are pi over 2, every 2 that I do. So my period is pi over 2, which tells me that 2 pi over b is going to equal pi over 2. Because again, the formula to get to my solution. So if I cross multiply, 4 pi equals pi b, and I'm like, oh, they each have a pi. Isn't that convenient? So my b value is going to be 4. Which makes sense because that bigger value here means my graph squishes. The bigger the number, the more it squishes. And then my last job, from here, how far is it to get back to the x-axis? I went down to, and that's the way it shifts. So I would like you to take a moment on 5. I want you to try something on your own for a minute. I will get it back up, so I'm not going to leave you without an answer. But take 5 for a moment. Try to do it on your own. I'm going to cover this up for a second. Try to do it on your home. For those of you viewing at home later, I will do it on here so you can see what's going on, and then I will explain once we get that checked back out here in just a second. So here you'll have an amplitude change, you'll have a vertical shift, and I won't say anything else about the period. Okay, let's take a peek here, see where everything is, where it's coming from. So my center line moved its way down to -2. So I noticed right away, to get from either a max or a min back to that line was 1/2 of a unit. So that was my amplitude. I'd noticed that I was getting the valley first, so that told me it was cosine. My period, at least I chose these. You could have chose from here to 2 pi as well, but it's still 2 pi. So my b value would just be 1. It's not going to shift it. It's not going to squish it. It's not going to open it at all. And then to get from my x-axis to my center line, my baseline to my new center line, I went down 2, which would mean I'd have a vertical shift of -2. So we should have 1/2 the cosine theta minus 2. And then that last one's going to be fairly similar. When I go for my center line, goes across there at 2, similar to what I had down below. Looks like I'm going to have to go 1/2 in either direction to get there. But this time, I see my peak first, which tells me it's sine. Let's see here. What do we have for a period this time? 4 pi. So if I go from here to here, I go from pi to 5 pi, which is 4 pi. But again, if I make 4 pi equal to 2 pi over b, it means that 4 pi b equals 2 pi. And we find out that b is 1/2. Check out all the fractions. And then to get from my new center line back to my base one, I went up 2, so that, oops, plus 2. And that gets me to my value. Yes, ma'am?
On the homework, are we going to see a phase shift?
Let's chat about that. When we get over here to the back, there are going to be 2 problems where you could see a possible phase shift, 18 and 20. So let's tackle one of these. And you're like, now how do you know that? Because I notice it doesn't go through the y-axis at all. These 2 start further over to the right and they don't keep going. Just because it goes through, like let's say 17 does, doesn't mean that you have to necessarily vertically shift. Now sometimes you may. That one you're like, well, that seems like the full period, so maybe I have to shift there, and maybe you do. So let's take a look just in this general area at these last 4, but I'm going to jump over to 18 here. So let's see what we got. Max at 6, min at 0. Looks like we're center lining it at 3. So I notice a couple of things. I notice that we are first going into the valley. So it looks like, what are we going to be getting for our initial base function here? Okay, we're initially thinking this is probably, ooh, now I'm hearing different things from people. I'm hearing whispers in the front and louder things from the back. Do we think this is sine or cosine? Okay. Because we're seeing the valley first, we're like, okay. So then, to get from here to my min, from here to my max is 3, right? Yeah. So we've got the 3. We've got my amplitude. Let's see, let's check out a period here. Now, this one's a little more interesting. pi over 4 to 5 pi over 4. So what's my period on this one? 1 pi. So if period's pi, what's my b value going to be? If it was 1/2, we'd be stretching more. We'd be out to 4 pi for our period if it was a half. So I've got that as pi. So let's see here. Which way does it look like my graph has shifted? Okay, right. If I have a phase shift, normally most of my graphs are all starting here at 0, but it looks like I've shifted right pi over 4. So what symbol do I need in front of my pi over 4? Negative, because we're liars inside of this parenthesis thing. So a right 4 shift will be minus. And then from my base to my new, whew, I went up to, I got everything in on that one. That was a doozy. So that could be a situation you get yourself into on 17, 18, 19, 20 here on the back. The rest of them all look fairly normal. So we will be playing with this a little more tomorrow. Also going to be playing a little bit. Just a little bit.
So this is homework check number 2.
Homework check 12. It'll be assignment number 2.
We do stop recording.
Question.
Okay.
Wouldn't that just be a negative sign? Wouldn't that be a flipped sign? Because
Well, let's see.
That is that flipped over.
Mr. Harty, we haven't finished recording.